Welcome, listeners, to the InFAWmation Nation, brought to you by the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, Division of Fish and Wildlife, Hunter Education Program. I am your host, Scott Travers, the Hunter Education Coordinator for the State of Rhode Island, and I have with me Dana Kopek, who is my technical assistant, who will be helping me out recording this podcast. We are coming to you from the Outdoor Education Office located within the Arcadia Management Area in Exeter, Rhode Island. As always, our focus is on hunting, hunter education, fishing, aquatic education, and all things wildlife outreach related in the state of Rhode Island. This episode, we'll be talking with Rhode Island Division of Fish and Wildlife's amphibian and reptile biologist, aka a herpetologist, Scott Buchanan, who will be discussing all things having to do with the conservation and management of amphibians and reptiles in the state of Rhode Island. So welcome, Scott. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure thing. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. It's a great opportunity to do some communication about amphibians and reptiles, which is what I do for fish and wildlife here. About myself, well, I've been in Rhode Island since 2013. I moved to Rhode Island to go to graduate school at URI. I'm originally from New Jersey. I went to high school and college there, but have lived in a number of different places in the Northeast United States. I did my master's work on Cape Cod. I worked for the National Park Service as a seasonal technician for 6 years. That was my introduction to herpetology after college, and did all sorts of fun stuff out there. I did my master's work out there, working with hognose snakes. That was a radio telemetry and habitat selection project. And then had the opportunity to come do a PhD at URI, and that lasted from 2013 to 2017. Worked with freshwater turtles, studying kind of their geographic distribution, population genetics, and that was my introduction to Rhode Island. For that project, I had to go out and trap a ton of turtles for 3 years, all over the state. I think it was 88 wetlands that I had to trap to generate this data set. And I got to know many different places in Rhode Island, really, parts of the entire state, and fell in love with it at that time. After I graduated, I was fortunate to get a job here. And now I work right across the street from URI in South Kingstown at Great Swamp, and love the job that I have.
That's awesome. So 88 different wetlands in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Well,
I bet it was a lot.
yeah. I bet a lot of people had no idea we even had that many wetlands.
Well, yeah. I mean, these were small. Some of these wetlands were not much bigger than the size of this room that we're sitting in, and it's not a very big room. And the idea was to go there, sample intensively for any type of freshwater turtle, generate a data set that could be used for what we call occupancy analysis, which the big idea is to try to understand what features of the wetland and the landscape explain what species of turtles are using those wetlands and in what types of abundances. But yeah, it was a wide variety of different wetland types, and it was an education in itself for me just to do all that field work in a state that I hadn't spent much time in at all previous to that. And it was hard, it was difficult, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, gotcha.
Well.
And that's one thing that is great about the state of Rhode Island is that even though we are pretty small, we've got a lot of diverse areas that just some people just aren't familiar with or aren't aware that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very true.
Oh, really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you've got a PhD from URI as well, so that's quite an advanced degree.
Yeah. It's the terminal degree for our field. I found myself in the position where even with a master's, it was not as easy as you'd like it to be to find a career position in wildlife biology, which was what I wanted to pursue. And so I had the opportunity to do the PhD and jumped at it, and no regrets with that.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
So, can you tell us something about the native species of amphibians and reptiles that occur in Rhode Island?
Sure. And yeah, my job title is herpetologist, which is just a biologist who studies amphibians and reptiles, which is a funny thing in and of itself, because amphibians and reptiles, evolutionarily speaking, aren't necessarily like wouldn't be grouped together, but that's how it is. So there are, between amphibians and reptiles, there's a number of different ways you could quantify it, but I usually settle on the number 37 native species that we have, and that's there's 12 snakes. There's 12 species of snakes, that is. There's 7 species of turtles. Those are the reptiles. And then you got 10 species of frogs and toads, and 8 species of salamanders. Those are the amphibians. And, you know, there's other animals out there that we would sort of categorize differently. For example, non-native invasive species, non-native exotic species, the distinction there being whether or not they're established in the landscape and breeding, or just kind of out there, you know, released or otherwise, in the case of exotic species. And then you have extirpated species too. We do have one example of an extirpated species, which is the timber rattlesnake. And that went extinct in Rhode Island around 1970. The last population was in Tiverton. And you, yeah, I mean, so we are such a small state, and yet we have almost 40 existing native species in the state, which keeps me busy. That's a lot for, you know, to try to make progress and understand what's happening for all those different species is quite a bit. And one other group I should mention are just sea turtles, which are out there. There's 4 that commonly occur in our coastal waters at certain times of the year. You know, they're all migratory, so they come up in the spring, stay until the fall, go back down south in the fall. You know, they're just pursuing food to eat in the water, but they're out there for a good majority of the year. They're in Long Island Sound, they're in Block Island Sound, they're in Narragansett Bay, and the waters north of us as well.
Gotcha. So you mentioned about that timber rattlesnake being extirpated. If you can just briefly describe the term extirpated for those of our listeners who might not be familiar with that term.
Yeah. It just means locally extinct. So if a species like the timber rattlesnake were extirpated in Rhode Island, it would no longer occur in Rhode Island, but it might occur, you know, right across the border in Massachusetts, which it still does. So it's just, you know, it means it's no longer here within some defined region, is all that means.
Right, gotcha. Okay, thank you. So are there any hunting or trapping opportunities for amphibians and reptiles in Rhode Island? Does that occur at all?
It does. For a select number of our common and abundant species, it does. And those species are the snapping turtle, for which one can trap, is I think the most common method of harvest for snapping turtles. And then there's also green frogs and bullfrogs, which one can harvest. In order to harvest either of those, snapping turtles, green frogs, or bullfrogs, one can have a trapping license, a hunting license, or a fishing license. And the frogs are popular for bait, you know, for fishing, for freshwater fishing. And snapping turtles are, you know, I think a traditional food item for some people.
Gotcha. So you talk about you can have either a hunting, trapping, or fishing license in order to harvest those. Is that dependent upon the means in which you harvest?
It's actually not. We revisited this in the regulations recently, and you know, rather than having like a specific pathway or permit for one to harvest individual species. We just said, let's make this as easy as possible, and let's make any one of those permits, appropriate for harvest.
Gotcha. Okay.
If that makes
Sounds
sense.
good. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
So what about possession of other native amphibians and reptiles? Is there a permit required for that?
Yeah, so we have strong protections in place for all the other native species of amphibians and reptiles out there. To put it simply, there is no real pathway for possession of any other native species. So if we're considering the 37 that occur in our terrestrial and freshwater environments, 34 of them are just off limits. In other words, you can't take them home as pets. You can't harvest them, and the only real means by which we allow for any possession or pursuit is with a scientific collector's permit. Those only really go to qualified researchers.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So one important note to probably make for our listeners and their families is that if you are out enjoying nature in Rhode Island and you come across some of these really cool and interesting creatures, it's probably not a good idea to touch or handle them.
We wouldn't recommend that. We're not worried about enforcing our possession regulations if your kid picks up a toad. That's not the intent. That's not the spirit of that regulation. There's good and bad ways to do that. Maybe we should talk about that a little bit. But, we're concerned with people taking native wildlife out of the environment, bringing it home, keeping it as a pet, exposing it to diseases from other animals, and then, putting it back out where it wasn't. That sort of thing, because that becomes really problematic really quickly. We're also really concerned with just the illegal trade of amphibians and reptiles, particularly turtles. There's several of our native species are in high demand in domestic and overseas markets, and that's we don't want our native wildlife to become a commodity.
So you would say that handling of amphibians is probably not ideal, but the real more important message for everyone is don't take them out of their environment and try to bring them home and make pets out of them.
Correct. Because then we're in a situation where we might enforce our regulations. I would just say this, because if you're out there, if you're in our management areas, if you're in a natural area, or if you're in a suburban and urban area in some cases, you might come across some really interesting, really beautiful wildlife. And I would say just let it go on its way. Just view it from a distance and let it go on its way.
Right, yeah, we don't want to take it out of its home.
Correct,
Gotcha.
exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about reptiles. So Can you tell us more about the species of reptiles that occur in Rhode Island?
Yeah, sure. And as I said, there's 12 species of snakes, native snakes, and we've got 7 species of turtles, plus 4, sometimes 5 sea turtles.
So when we talk about the different snakes we have in Rhode Island, are they generally located in certain areas, or do we have all of these snakes throughout the state?
It's dependent by species.
Mm-hmm.
We have a number of those are common species of snakes, like the garter snake that most people know. Milk snakes are another common one. Even black racers are fairly widespread. Brown snakes, DeKay's brown snakes, that's a really common one. And those can occur in almost any environment, including urban environments in the state. And then the other side of the coin, you have species like the black rat snake, the eastern hognose snake, which are only found in relatively undisturbed, rural, forested areas, that kind of thing. The eastern hognose snake, which is what I studied during my master's. It's a real sandy soil specialist. Eats a lot of toads. It has specialized adaptations to eat toads. a really cool species, really awesome if you're lucky enough to stumble across one out there somewhere in Rhode Island. Really cool to observe.
Oh, that's neat.
Yeah.
So certainly they have their role to play within the environment and within the ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. It's true of all our native species that, they have ecological value. They have ecosystem value. They serve as predators. They eat things. They serve as prey. They're eaten by other things. They transfer energy through the environment.
Scott, what's the largest snake we have in Rhode Island?
It's got to be the rat snake, the black rat snake. And the only competition there might be the black racer. They both can get pretty big, certainly in excess of 5 feet, maybe up to 6 feet. In the case of the rat snake and a really big racer. Rat snake's a bit more robust body, wider body. They're often confused. They're both large, relatively large black snakes. They can be difficult to tell apart from a distance, but they have some key features that, if you have them in hand, they're easy to tell apart. For example, the racer has smooth scales. The black rat snake has what we call keeled scales. There's a line right down the middle of it. The body shape, the racer is circular. The rat snake, it's kind of shaped like a loaf of bread, where the bottom of the body is flat. And the racer is called a racer because it moves really, really fast. So sometimes, whenever you stumble across a big black snake that moves really rapidly back into the brush, that's going to be a black racer. That's a good indication that it's a black racer, because the rat snake just can't move like that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Understood. So people ask all of the time about venomous snakes in the state of Rhode Island. And
Yes,
can you
they
set
do.
us
Yes,
set
they
us
do.
straight on the record?
Yeah, sure. To put it simply, there are no venomous snakes in Rhode Island. And that's worth emphasizing, because just like you said, that's a question we get a lot. Sometimes folks respectfully disagree with that, but that is the case. There are no venomous snakes in Rhode Island. As we mentioned, timber rattlesnakes used to be here, but they were extirpated in 1970. There's no reason to think, there's no compelling reason to think that they're still here in the state, unfortunately, because I, for one, would prefer that they were. But that's a story of, snake conservation. It's a difficult topic. In the region, there are both timber rattlesnakes and copperheads. And copperheads occur just across the border as well, in Massachusetts and in Connecticut. So the question of, historically, if there were ever copperheads in Rhode Island, that's more of an open question, but we've never had a confirmed record or even a credible record of a copperhead in Rhode Island. So again, no compelling reason to think that they're here.
Okay.
And all our other native snakes are non-venomous.
Gotcha. So if people saw a snake and they were unsure of what it was, is there a way for them to report that or
Yeah.
to let somebody know about that?
Yeah, get as high quality a picture as you can and reach out to us. Send that to the Rhode Island Division of Fish and Wildlife. Send that to me directly. My email's up on our website. And we'll ID that for you. And that's a common thing that we do. People have concerns about snakes because there are venomous, dangerous snakes out there in the world. And it's not a concern here, but nonetheless, that concern persists here. We're happy to do that. That's an easy thing for us to do. And I should also take this opportunity to mention that we have an app, a smartphone app. It's called Herp Observer. It's really easy to use, even if you're not accustomed to a lot of apps on your phone. But all you have to do is enter your name. The app itself defaults to the date, time, and your location, and then you just take a photo, upload that, and then that record goes right to our secure database. And all those observations, and we've had this app for basically 2.5 years, and we've accumulated over 1,500 verified observations to date. And that's data. That's important data. That helps us with our inventory and monitoring. And yeah, that's another thing you can do. I'll just point out, if you do that, we're not going to get back to you. So if you really want to know what species you're dealing with, you'd have to reach out to us directly. In the app, we ask that you identify the species yourself. And then at some point down the line, we go through all the records we get in a year and confirm them. But we don't reach out to folks if they got it wrong.
So at least that way you have that information, like you said, it's a data record. Yeah. And if somebody's out there and they're in nature, it's a way to help them kind of help us out at DEM and kind of help them become citizen scientists, sort of.
Yeah, exactly. That's the intent. And it is important. It's become a major source of data collection for us, and it allows us to collect some meaningful data on species occurrence from areas that we otherwise wouldn't,
Right. It's tough to staff with so many people to go to all these remote areas in the state of Rhode Island.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Tell us about lizards in Rhode Island. Do we have a variety of lizards?
We do not have a variety. Well, this is an interesting question, actually. There are no native lizards in Rhode Island, but there are some lizards out there in Rhode Island. And we've learned this recently. I think it was last year, 2020. And it was in the news. You can Google this. There were a couple independent instances of 5-line skinks that were found. This is like last spring, and the 5-line skink, it occurs not too far away from here. Its native range is not too far from here, kind of in the western half of Connecticut. So the question was raised: is this a native species? I settled on no. I don't think so. I don't think that in and of itself is compelling enough evidence to think that the 5-line skink has been here all along and we've just missed it to date. Rather, I think that these are animals that were transported to Rhode Island, maybe from not that far away, maybe with lumber, mulch, pile of mulch that's moved around, either an animal or some eggs just came across state lines, and they ended up here. And they can certainly persist. They're cold adapted. That species is cold adapted to a degree. And it's not inconceivable that they could persist even over winter. Whether or not they're reproducing is another question. And that's the distinction between a non-native invasive and a non-native exotic. It's not impossible that you can find a lizard out there in Rhode Island. And then there's another species that, in my mind, is much more problematic, and that's the brown anole, another small lizard. And their native range is the Caribbean, but they're super invasive in Florida, up into Georgia. And what we've learned recently is that they're coming into Rhode Island on a regular basis in like potted plants, house plants. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's probably been happening even for some time, and we've just started to document it, I would say. It's an example of how Herp Observer is helping us. It also helps us learn more about exotic species, because we've had several observations submitted through that. But they're out there. They're out there. And the hope is that they don't become invasive. That's not quite as cold tolerant a species, so it would be surprising if they were persisting through the winter. But then again, they can go down in somebody's basement, and, where the temperatures are moderated and be just fine.
Right.
They're not necessarily out there in the wild. I have a brown anole in my office at home, which came from Westerly that somebody found.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the possession of those as non-native animals is unregulated. You don't need a permit or anything. So if you find one, that's a great opportunity to get a free pet. Bring it inside. Keep it inside your house. Give it a nice home, and don't put it back out there.
Gotcha.
Don't put it back outside.
Understand.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some turtles that we might have.
Yeah, turtles. Turtles are kind of my specialty, I guess you might say. I've more experience with them than any other group of amphibians or reptiles. And they demand a lot of my time and attention in this position because of their conservation priority. We have a number of species that are of elevated conservation concern, particularly the diamondback terrapin, the wood turtle, the spotted turtle, and the eastern box turtle. And there's a lot of work in the region as well, in the Northeast. So I work a lot with other states, counterparts from other states, in these regional projects, which are focused generally on inventory and monitoring, development of conservation plans and best management practices, documents, as well as, habitat management and applied conservation. I could talk all day about each of these species. We've got a lot going on for each of them, which is really great. I'll highlight a couple things, starting with the diamondback terrapin. So we've learned a lot about them in the last couple of years. And one of the first things I did when I started this job 3.5 years ago was to reach out to the Barrington Land Conservation Trust, who has, it's about 30 years old now. They have a diamondback terrapin nest protection project at one of their parcels, local, conservation parcels. And it was started around 1990. A woman, Charlotte Sornberger, among others, Pete McCalmont, they started this project, and it's pretty simple. You look out for nesting diamondback terrapins, you identify where they're nesting, you cover the nest, and that protects the nest from predators, because predation is naturally really high in turtle nests. It's been really effective. That project has been instrumental, I would say, in the recovery of the diamondback terrapin in Rhode Island.
Wow.
Particularly in that part of Rhode Island, up there in Barrington and the Upper Bay. And the project has, it's grown over the years, and since I've been here, we've gotten a bit more involved. And that's kind of, that's the crown jewel of diamondback terrapin conservation, if not turtle conservation in the state. It's a really great project, and I want to highlight it because I want to give those folks the credit that they deserve. We've helped out in various ways, but it's really championed by local volunteers that decided a long time ago they were going to be committed to conservation, and that effort has certainly borne fruit over the decades. Another species I'll highlight is the wood turtle, and I should say, even among those 4 species, it's probably, it's the diamondback terrapin and the wood turtle that are the highest conservation priority, or which are the rarest species in the state, in other words. So any focus, any attention, any help we can give to those 2 species, that's really important.
So if I can ask, the program that was started in Barrington, is there any plans to expand that program into other communities?
Well, it's something that we've discussed. We can certainly take that model and apply it in other parts of the state. And we're sort of at a phase now where we're trying to learn as much as possible about the actual geographic distribution for terrapins in the state. And we've made really good headway there in the last few years. But we haven't gotten to the point where we're, doing nest protection in other parts of the state yet. I think once we know, okay, this area is where we want to focus our attention, because it is a super labor-intensive process. You have to be out there basically every day for at least a month. And then depending on how you build your nest protectors, you might have to be out there again every day for another month when the hatchlings are coming up. There are no current plans, but it's certainly something that I wouldn't be surprised if we, at some point, do institute a different population or additional populations.
Gotcha. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned these species of concern, and what makes them a species of concern?
Well, I guess one way to think about it is the probability of extinction, or extirpation, I should say. So, we want to focus there's this idea of doing ecological triage, right? There's only so much time resources, personnel to go out there and do wildlife conservation. And we need to focus that attention on the species that need the most urgent help. And so it can be difficult to decide where to focus that attention. But the diamondback terrapin, the wood turtle are two examples of species that clearly need our help in the state to recover populations and just to prevent further decline of populations.
What would you say would be the number one threat to them? Like, I know for most things, we all, point, towards habitat loss.
Yeah, and that's it. You nailed it. If that's most often the case, habitat loss, pure loss, habitat degradation, habitat fragmentation, which are related but slightly different. That's the biggest key, which makes land preservation, acquisition and preservation probably the most important thing you can do in wildlife conservation. And then there's for turtles in particular, there's a host of other threats. Road mortality can be one. Illegal collection can be another. Disease is another. And, non-native competition from non-native invasive species can be another. That's why the red-eared slider is a species that can directly compete with some of our native turtles. Yeah, which makes for, a difficult environment for turtles and everything else.
Right.
There's more and more people in the world all the time. Rhode Island is the second highest human population density in the country. So our impact is out there on the landscape and increasing all the time. And so we have to do whatever we can to minimize, mitigate, and reduce that impact.
Gotcha.
On species, yeah.
So while we talk about these threats, what are you able to do in your job in order to mitigate these?
Yeah. Well, I would say the most important thing that we do as a division, or DEM does anyway, is the land acquisition process. That's huge. Setting aside land that, in perpetuity, that can't be developed and is managed with wildlife in mind, that's number one. And then more specifically for amphibians and reptiles, on our lands, we do habitat management. And that is, some examples might be like the creation of nesting areas for turtles. This is stuff that we've done. The timing of certain events, taking into consideration the timing of certain events, like mowing, like timber harvests, prescribed burns. If you do it at the wrong time, you can have a big impact. If you do it at a more benign time, you can really limit your impact. So that can have a really, really big impact over time. Other examples, applied conservation, under that include things like minimizing road mortality, whether that's fencing off particularly problematic roads to keep animals from going up on the roads, or to build tunnels or overpasses even to get animals under or above the roads to prevent them from getting hit.
Right.
And we don't have any real good examples of that in Rhode Island that the division has been involved in, but it's something that we're going to be looking to get involved in going forward. There's monies in the latest transportation bill. A lot of money set aside actually for the reduction of road mortality for wildlife. And it's not just big animals out west like elk and deer and bear and everything else. The language in that bill, which is really exciting to me, makes clear that they want to, the intent is to reduce the impacts of road mortality for wildlife broadly, including
right.
small animals, amphibians, reptiles, small mammals. So hopefully we'll be able to, make some ground there. And then another thing is research. The more we know about populations and individual animals in certain spots, the more we can tailor habitat management. And that's, I've been involved with a number of research projects now at a URI, involving wood turtles, involving road mortality, involving diamondback terrapins, that has already proved helpful in steering management.
Oh, that's great.
Respects. Yeah, yeah.
Wow. So let's switch gears again and talk a little bit about amphibians.
Yeah, amphibians. Again, 10 frogs and toads and 8 salamanders. A really cool variety of amphibians. Amphibians are, for the most part, there's a couple exceptions, but for the most part, they require freshwater wetlands, freshwater habitats in order to carry out their life history. All of our frogs and toads and most of our salamanders lay their eggs in wetlands, in freshwater wetlands, which makes the protection and ensuring a lack of degradation of those wetlands really important.
So do we have any invasive species of amphibians?
We do. We have at least one, which is the mud puppy. Yeah, interestingly enough, it's kind of it's a large salamander is what it is. And we have enough information to know, there's only a few observations of them in certain reservoirs, but we have enough information to know, I would say, that they appear to be out there. They're persistent. They appear to be reproducing, at least in one or two places where I would consider them a non-native invasive. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. And are they going to, can you predict that they will be displacing some of our native wildlife?
It's hard to say, but the potential is certainly there. Where they came from is an interesting question. They were probably released by someone either in the pet trade or in the research community going way back. There's a particular example of that in, I want to say, Maine. I don't think that's happened recently.
Gotcha. Something from a while ago.
Yeah. There's always a potential for that, but it's hard to say. And at what level? I don't know how much concern there is, to be honest, with that. Okay. Yeah, there's no evidence that they're like spreading out, becoming widespread or anything like that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. There are also, we have, just like with reptiles, we have examples of exotics as well. Things that just show up and probably die off, but are released by the pet trade or come up in potted plants, just like with the brown anoles. We've had instances of Cuban tree frogs. I don't know. I can't think of others. I know there's others, but there's funny stuff that ends up out there.
Right. Yeah. You never know what you're gonna run into. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Gotcha. So I know that in some places people use salamanders as bait for fishing.
Correct.
Is there anything like that here in Rhode Island?
No, we don't allow for the opportunity to use salamanders as bait. The reason being, all of our native salamanders that you might use for bait are of elevated conservation concern, and they're all what we call species of greatest conservation need. They're listed in our Wildlife Action Plan as SGCN species, and therefore we don't allow for their possession or their use as bait.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's good to know.
Yeah, that's an important one.
Yeah. So can you tell me about spadefoot toads? I know you've been involved with those.
Yeah. Spadefoot toads are really cool, and it's a fun story to tell, because the recent efforts surrounding their conservation have involved a lot of partners, and it's just been a great partnership to be a part of. So spadefoot toads they may be the rarest frog in Rhode Island, frog or toad, which are kind of the same thing. But anyway, it's either them or northern leopard frogs. And spadefoot toads are super rare on the landscape. Part of the reason has to do with impacts, and part of the reason has to do with the fact that they're a really specialized species. So they breed in really small, really ephemeral wetlands, the most temporary of vernal pools is what they breed in. And they breed explosively. So they can go literally years without breeding until enough rain falls where a puddle in a field or the side of the road fills up just enough so that they all congregate, they mate, they lay their eggs, and then those eggs can hatch out within 24 to 48 hours, and you can have larval, you can have tadpoles turn into toadlets within as little as 2 weeks, which is incredibly fast. It usually takes months for all our other species. And then they're also sandy soil specialists. So you're only going to find them in areas where the soil is sandy enough. They burrow down. They come out at night. They move around and forage, but they're in those sandy areas, relatively undisturbed areas. So a lot of their breeding wetlands have been filled in, for one reason or another, development or agriculture, and that's impacted their populations. There's no question about that. We know that that populations have declined, and that in a lot of historic areas where we have records, they no longer occur. So Operation Spadefoot was kind of started up at URI by Professor Nancy Carricker, and it was in the spirit of, let's get all hands on deck, let's do whatever we can to help this species in Rhode Island. And it's come to involve a number of partners, including the Rhode Island Natural History Survey, Roger Williams Park Zoo, NRCS, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as a number of local land trust partners.
Right. So NRCS would be?
NRCS is the Natural Resource Conservation Service. It's a federal agency. Yeah. Basically like every major conservation group in the state almost,
Wow.
The Nature Conservancy plays a role. It's a really awesome project. And what we've done, the biggest thing we've done thus far is to reconstruct some of those really specialized wetland types on the landscape in strategic areas where one of two things will take place. Either those wetlands are close enough to existing populations of spadefoot that we hope the spadefoot will colonize them and use them and reproduce in them, and thereby their populations will grow. Or we're going to reintroduce, and we've done this, reintroduce tadpoles, reintroduce spadefoots in the form of tadpoles or metamorphs to new areas where we've built pools. And it's probably in year 2 really of being off the ground. 2022 will be year 3. So we're at an early stage of what will certainly be a long-term project to reintroduce and restore populations of spadefoot toads to new areas. But we're off and running, and I'm pretty optimistic that this project will have a positive impact in restoring populations.
Wow.
For sure. And yeah, it's the kind of thing that we've got to do, to counteract the impacts that we have on the landscape to some of these species.
Right, gotcha. And that's kind of probably the, biggest threat to the population.
Yeah. In the case of spadefoots, it's the removal of these wetlands, which,
right.
There's wetland protection laws that have been in place in Rhode Island for some time, but oftentimes these little puddles that don't hold water most of the year are overlooked. And that's starting to change, and this is, a direct counteraction to that.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
Gotcha. Cool. So why is it worthwhile for the state to engage in, the amphibian and reptile conservation efforts?
Yeah. Well, big picture, this native wildlife, not just amphibians and reptiles, but native wildlife is our natural heritage. And they provide a host of ecosystem services. Thinking globally now, thinking beyond Rhode Island and thinking globally, we know worldwide that not only has there just been an incredible acceleration of extinction rates, but in addition to that, the abundance of wildlife, pick your species, has declined incredibly in the last 50 years, even 30, 40, 50 years. That's a problem. That affects everything we do. And I guess we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to respond to that here in Rhode Island? We can have a state government that is involved, or we can have a state government that's not involved. And I would hope that the majority of people in Rhode Island want to be involved. And if we're going to do that, we've got to play an active role. And that's where my position comes in with respect to amphibians and reptiles. We've got to understand what's going on our landscape. And then we've got to respond to that in appropriate ways and prevent extinctions or extirpations and prevent just this erosion of, abundance of all these populations. And, that's like an ethical, a moral argument, perhaps. And maybe that doesn't get traction with everyone, but I think it's the most important argument to make.
Right. It's important to consider, like you're saying, all species, not just one particular species or aspect of the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And it's also important not to just concern yourself with what happens right here in a specific town or a specific state. It's great to have these partnerships, like you say, with Massachusetts and Connecticut at the federal level to look at the bigger pictures, because very often it's the things that happen outside of the borders of our immediate area that have great effects on the things that we have.
Yeah, that absolutely. And if we're going to strive to protect biodiversity, which is what this is, somebody's going to have that 30,000 foot view, and work with partners to see the big picture, and do everything we can to prevent biodiversity loss.
Right. Gotcha. So how do you think climate change is going to affect amphibians and reptiles?
That's a great question and a really interesting question, because it's difficult to say. It's complex, and it could go a number of different ways, and I think that it's very species dependent as well. So, for example, let's consider two species that we've already discussed a little bit. Diamondback terrapin, number one, and then I'll talk about the spadefoot toad. But diamondback terrapin, they exist just in the coastal fringe of the United States. So salt marshes, brackish waters. That's their essential required habitat. That's the only place they can live based on their natural history. And what do we know? What is climate change going to bring? It's going to bring sea level rise. It already has. And that's resulted in the loss of salt marshes. The rate of salt marsh loss in Rhode Island is really high. And that's absolutely essential habitat to that species. So that worries me a lot. In 30, 40, 50, 100 years, what sort of salt marsh habitat is going to be left in Rhode Island? We're going to have to do everything we can to ensure that there's enough, as much as possible, if that species is going to persist here. We don't have huge, expansive salt marsh environments like other parts of the country do, even nearby parts of the country like Connecticut. We have like really narrow kind of fringe salt marsh. And yeah, so that one worries me. I would expect there will be at least some impacts to diamondback terrapins in Rhode Island as a result of climate change.
Gotcha.
And now the spadefoot toad, we went through their really specialized natural history. You know, they breed during big precipitation events, nor'easters and hurricanes, and that's helpful to that species. So if the intensity and frequency of storms for the spadefoot toad is going to increase over time, it's very possible that it could benefit that species, you know, and that there could be more breeding opportunity for that species. So it's really a mixed bag. I think that, you know, we need to identify what species will be at risk and do what we can to help those species bridge what will be this really intense and dynamic period of time when things are changing extremely rapidly. And yeah, I don't know. Another interesting question is what about species migrations? You know, what about southern species moving up in terms of latitude? And
there's no real one easy answer to these questions. I know.
You can have a whole philosophical debate about how that should proceed.
Right.
Some of these invasive species that maybe are not cold tolerant might have a more favorable environment, as winters are not as cold as they used to be. They might be more likely to persist. It's going to go in many different directions. And I think focused on conservation and conserving our native species, again, we have to identify those which will be most at risk.
Right. Gotcha. So what's your long-term kind of prognosis for amphibians and reptiles?
Well, one thing I didn't say, which I should, I like to stress to people and make the case that to be in herpetology is to be on the front lines of the biodiversity crisis, the global biodiversity crisis. When you talk about vertebrate groups which are most at risk, frogs and turtles are kind of neck and neck for like the highest proportion of species that are at risk of extinction. And that's, I'm speaking globally now, but that carries over to Rhode Island. So I think that we, in the absence of effort, the prognosis would not be good for a lot of species. I think there's potential that we could lose serious ground to extinction, to biodiversity loss, and we want to do our best to prevent that. Again, it's difficult to predict like where things are going to go. My hope is that we as a society will prioritize biodiversity conservation and we'll find ways to minimize and mitigate the impacts that we have to, you know, all these species.
Right. Gotcha.
Which gives me optimism. So I don't know. It's a mix of pessimism and optimism, you might say, but it's always the optimist who gets stuff done in this world. So I try to focus on that and do everything that we can.
Gotcha. And raising awareness so people are aware of these issues. That way they take an interest in them as well. Yeah. So let me ask, how can our listeners reach out to you if they have a question, like they have an identification issue, or if they see something, and they're concerned about it, or if they have something that they want to report?
Yeah, I mean, I guess email is the best way. We'll make sure we get my email associated with this somehow. It's on the website. Reach out to me or reach out to the Rhode Island Division of Fish and Wildlife, however you can, and we'll get back to you. That's part of our job. We serve the public. We work for the public. And I love stuff like that. You know, It's fun to have conversations, just talk to people about what they've seen. I love to do the species ID. That's easy. That's fun for me. And I should also mention, we rely heavily on volunteers within the non-game wildlife program. So if you're interested in volunteering, we have a number of different projects that you can get involved in, and reach out to myself or Jen Brooks at Fish and Wildlife, and who's our volunteer coordinator, and we'll get you plugged in.
That's fantastic. And I almost actually forgot to mention this. Usually we have one funny story from the field that we like to get from our guests. And I think you're probably queued up to give us one of the best ones.
Yeah. I don't have one in stock. Let me think. Okay, so for this story, I'm going to go back to my days as a PhD student. 88 wetlands, right? Trapping turtles all around the state. I did this for 3 years, really intense during the spring, summer, and fall. And I was dating a gal when I started who lived in New York City. And she would occasionally come up. And this particular time, this is the last day in the 3rd year of field data collection. And the last wetland, the last pond, we're pulling traps. And I'm at the last trap, pulling the last trap from the last wetland on the last day of field data collection. And I got stuck in the mud in a pair of waders. And I mean stuck in the mud, like no joke, where I couldn't move. And fortunately, this wonderful gal was with me, and she found a big stick, and she threw it out to me. She was in a pair of waders. She was helping me in the field all this day, and she found a big stick, and it was a struggle for me to get out, but that stick was the difference in me getting out. And
or you'd still be there.
Or I'd still be there. And the most important part of this story is that wonderful gal from New York City moved up to Rhode Island to live with me and became my wife about 2 years ago. We got married, and that's maybe a good metaphor for our relationship.
That's probably the best story I've heard.
And it's actually true.
That's excellent.
It sounds like too ridiculous to be true, but it's actually exactly true.
Truth is stranger than fiction, they say.
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, that's a great story, and I'm glad to see that now you're going to be well looked after.
Yes, thankfully.
Fantastic.
I wouldn't have made it this far if not for her.
Right, I hear you. I hear you on that.
Thank you, Sarah.
Wow, excellent. So fantastic. Well, Scott, thank you so much for being here and giving us such great information on amphibians and reptiles in the state of Rhode Island.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for the opportunity to do some public outreach, and always looking to get the story out there, and want folks out there in Rhode Island to understand and appreciate our amphibians and reptiles.
Absolutely. I know we didn't have much of a chance to talk about sea turtles this time around, but maybe we can have you back on the show at another time so we can discuss those in depth.
That would be cool. That'd be fun.
Fantastic. Thank you to our guest, Scott Buchanan, for joining us on the podcast. Tune in next month for another exciting and informative episode of the InFAWmation Nation. If you have any questions for our guests or any of our staff, you can always reach out to me at scott.travers@dem.ri.gov. Please remember to subscribe and share our podcast. And until next time, we encourage all our listeners to get outside and enjoy the wonderful outdoor world and natural resources that we all share in the beautiful state of Rhode Island.